Lou would come back from the studio and say, they're not listening to me. They're not listening to the way I want things done. They were not selling a lot of records. He wasn't making significant money out of the group. He got really frustrated, and instead of maybe, as he would have a year or two earlier, fighting to get his own way, just figuring, I want to walk away from this. I'm getting too burnt out by it.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, conversations with authors, musicians, and insiders revealing the stories behind classic rock's greatest songs, albums, and artists. A big thank you to Ray Clark, the latest subscriber to Booked on Rock's Backstage Pass. If you're enjoying the show and would like to support it, you can join the Booked on Rock Backstage Pass on Patreon for just $5 a month. Every episode commercial-free and before everyone else. You can use the link in the show notes or visit bookedonrock.com. Now, on to our guest. Richie Unterberger is the author of Do What You Fear Most, The History of the Velvet Underground. Richie, I had you on a while back for your Bob Marley book. It is great to have you back on again.
Thanks, Eric. It's good to be back.
Let's start with the title, Do What You Fear Most, a striking phrase. This comes from a Velvet Underground song. What led to choosing that title to best represent the Velvet Underground story?
I wanted a lyric from a Velvet Underground song, and some of the very obvious contenders had already been taken by other books, sometimes books which were not about the Velvet Underground or about music. But I think it is suitable because it wasn't just in lyrics that the Velvet Underground explored territory that a lot of, or almost all other popular musicians were afraid to do. They also did so in many different aspects in the sonics of their music, aside from their lyrics incorporating influences from the avant-garde and from electronics, improvising a lot and changing material from performance to performance, and also their varied lineup. There are a couple things I'll say about how unconventional the lineup was. I can't think of another group, certainly from that time, where the three most visible members, the ones that became most famous, were from such different backgrounds. You had Lou Reed, a rock and roll fan from suburban Long Island, who was also into literature. John Cale, a classically trained musician on several instruments from Wales, and Nico from Germany, who was mostly known as a model and an actress and had very little professional singing experience. But on their first album, all three of them combined to create music that none of them could have come close to achieving on their own. And also to have a group from that time with two women. I know Nico was only in the group for a year and a half in their first album. There was no other top artistically group in rock in the 1960s that had a woman drummer, and the drummer, Maureen Tucker, had a very unusual style that nobody else had. And although Nico was in the group for only their first album and only a few songs, she went on to carve a very idiosyncratic and creative solo career, the early part of which I also cover in my book.
Lou described Freeport, Long Island, as the most boring place on earth. Rock and roll really fueled his ambition and would be his ticket out. And you write that rock and roll didn't just entertain Lou, it gave him a completely different vision of life. Was that common among teenagers of his generation, or was Lou's obsession unique?
I think Lou was more intensely inspired by rock and roll than most teenagers, but I think that rock and roll itself, arriving for most teenagers on the scene unexpectedly and really thrillingly, it had that effect, whether they went into music or not, to give them feelings, emotions, maybe lead them toward experiences that they didn't even know that they had. But Lou Reed's devotion to rock and roll was perhaps off the charts, even compared to many musicians who went into professional rock music.
You devote considerable attention to his electroshock treatments, which have become one of the defining stories of his life. What misconceptions were you hoping to clear up?
It wasn't so much I was hoping to clear up misconceptions, but I gathered different perspectives. The one that is most common that Reed himself helped popularize in some of his comments was that he was displaying gay tendencies or bisexual tendencies, which were much less accepted in the 1950s than they are now. They are more accepted to at least some degree now. And his parents were sort of trying to cure him of that because, or through electroshock therapy, which wasn't as controversial in the 50s as it would be in subsequent decades. But others who were around Lou at the time felt like the parents weren't so much motivated by his sexual tendencies as his depression, his general depression, which apparently was pretty severe shortly after the time that he was in high school. And with a more limited knowledge of what could be done back in the late 50s, they were desperate to find something that would help Lou Reed. And that was one of the alternatives that they tried. And perhaps they regretted that. His sister said that, although I didn't interview her directly, I did interview a lot of people for the group, but she has said in comments many years later, she felt that their parents didn't have anything malicious in their intention, that they were just trying somewhat out of desperation to get Lou out of that state. And somebody who played with Lou Reed in his early groups, very early before the Velvet Underground, had a similar sentiment. But I think that Lou's unconventional behavior in general, and not just his sexual experimentation, was something that his parents and many parents of the time would have found worrisome because it's something they weren't expecting. And he was from a fairly normal middle-class background, fairly standard one, and he was developing into something they had never expected.
He and John Cale, born just days apart, but like you say, they came from completely different musical worlds. John's work with Lamont Young and the Theater of Eternal Music was hugely influential. Why were those experiences so important to the sound that Cale would later bring to the Velvet Underground?
Cale he moved to the United States specifically because he wanted to get involved in the New York avant-garde scene with people like John Cage. But it turned out, although he did meet John Cage, that it was Lamont Young and the musicians playing with Lamont Young with whom he really felt he found his footing. And they were pioneering what was going to become known as minimalism, especially these drones that might elevate you into a trance-like state. But he and one of the other guys who played with Lamont Young a lot, Tony Conrad, they didn't shut themselves out to popular music, in part because they heard some similarities with what some acts from rock and roll were doing. Not just groups emerging in the British invasion, but even earlier, the Everly Brothers. They felt that the harmonies those guys did almost created these overtones, which had some similarity to what they were doing with their drones. And when Cale and Conrad, almost by accident, were asked to see if they could join Lou in a rock and roll group by the record label that Lou was working for, Pickwick Records, and they heard the record that Reed had already recorded under the Primitives name, The Ostrich, John Cale was certainly struck that the unusual guitar sound of that record was achieved by tuning all of the guitar strings to the same note. And in the Theater of Eternal Music, Cale and Conrad had been doing something similar, and they realized that the gap between their very avant-garde music, which had no chance of selling a lot of records or being on AM radio, and the straightforward rock and roll that Lou Reed excelled at, it wasn't that big. And especially because Reed was starting to write these very unconventional lyrics with unconventional song structures, what Cale was doing with Lamont Young could fit as the setting for those songs very well and create something that was very new in terms of what could be done in rock music.
Sterling Morrison, he gets overshadowed by Lou Reed and John Cale, yet he was there almost from the very beginning, Why do you think he is the unsung hero of the Velvet Underground?
I don't know if he's the absolute unsung hero. He's an unsung hero in some ways because he didn't, although he sometimes contended he should have gotten writing credits, his contributions were more in arranging than writing the words or the melody. So he wasn't the songwriter that Reed was, and that Cale was to some degree, even with the Velvet Underground, and which Nico would become. And also, although he did play some lead guitar, the guitar in the Velvet Underground was sort of a combination of him and Lou Reed, who was a very underrated, adventurous guitarist. But I think that he, with his music, his guitar playing, and his personality, gave the group a grounding where if Reed and Cale had been left more to their own devices, the music wouldn't have had nearly as much structure and whatever appeal that it had to begin with, and certainly in the subsequent decades since the group disbanded. And also, it was a volatile combination of personalities. They had, I think, a lot of affection for each other, but they were, especially Reed and Cale near the beginning, very strong-willed, and they wanted to have things done a certain way, which might have been hard to combine if they were butting heads. And Sterling Morrison was somebody who could level the field and cool those guys out and help them achieve a middle ground, at least when John Cale was in the group, which he was for like 3.5 years.
Lou and John pushed each other creatively, like few songwriting partners ever have. Do you think either one would have achieved the same artistic heights without the other?
No, I don't think either one would have gotten to where the Velvet Underground did when they combined forces. It's hard to say, but I think Lou Reed might have stayed more in the standard rock and roll world. He was writing as a staff songwriter for a really cheap budget label, and he was doing or working towards some songs like Pale Blue Eyes and Heroin on his own, but it was meeting John Cale which I think made him more determined to focus on that area of his work rather than, I'll try and sound like somebody else, write these songs and get them published. And John Cale, an interesting comment he had in an interview when they were starting to work up some of those unconventional songs was that the music is not fitting the lyrics of these songs. It's still sounding, when they were first rehearsing, like folk revival music, very folky music. It has to not just reflect the lyrics, but be just as adventurous and relatively out there as the compositions themselves are. And I think that combination, especially, although the other members of the Velvet Underground were very important, was what set that group aside from all others by the end of 1965, before they had made their first record.
Such a unique chemistry. Yeah, Maureen Tucker, almost no professional drumming experience. Why did they believe she was the right choice?
Their original drummer, Angus McLeese, was very much from the avant-garde world of John Cale. He had played with Lamont Young. And it's unfortunate there are no recordings of him with the Velvets in 1965. There's a little on film with him in 1966. He had a style of drumming which has been compared to the sound of falling rain. Now, that might be interesting, but it's not something that could create the kind of tempos for rock songs, or at least the kind of rock songs that the Velvets eventually created. But also, he left the group unexpectedly near the end of 1965. He wasn't kicked out because he was so uncompromising in his avant-garde vision that he felt it was a sellout to be paid for playing. And when the Velvet Underground got their first relatively conventional gig at a high school in suburban New Jersey, he quit, and the Velvet Underground were in a panic because they needed a drummer within a few days. And Maureen was originally recruited, I think, out of a sense of emergency. We don't really know any drummers, but we do know that our friend, Sterling and Lou's friend, Jim Tucker, who had gone to the same college as Lou, we know he has a younger sister who played drums. And they had met the younger sister before. But they auditioned her because we need somebody right now, and it also helped that she had access to a car and amplifiers,
Wow.
But to their credit, they realized very quickly she's a really good fit stylistically for the group. Both of those guys and Sterling Morrison, I don't think they would have put up with somebody who was just in there to fill a spot for a gig or two as an emergency. And her style did really fit because even though it might not have been as technically sophisticated as many other rock drummers, it had that insistent pounding rhythm which really helped drive the message of the songs home. And she could vary the tones of the drums, for instance, in Heroin, but also All Tomorrow's Parties, the almost funereal low notes, they really add to the drama of those songs, and some others that I could name. She had a very unusual technical style where she played standing up, and no other drummers had exactly that style. So it ended up being a really good fit for the group. And as a personality, Doug Yule, who replaced John Cale, told me this, that she really helped the whole group get along, especially Lou Reed, who could be pretty moody, get along with the rest of the group. And that when she became pregnant and could not play on their fourth album, Loaded, that was a big mistake that they didn't wait until she could play. Not only because they really needed her drummer skills to be their best, but also because as a personality, she could smooth things over and make them all get along better.
Andy Warhol, often credited with discovering the Velvet Underground. How accurate is that? And what was his real contribution to the band?
He didn't really discover them. It was more that other people in Andy Warhol's factory became aware of them, and within a few weeks, when they were playing a small club in Greenwich Village, got other members of the factory to watch them, and then Andy Warhol, near the end of that month, December 1965, came by. It seems that Barbara Rubin, who was also a filmmaker, was the first person in that crowd to really like the Velvet Underground, and Gerard Berlanga came along relatively soon afterward and danced to the group, and they really liked that, and he really liked the group. He was an assistant of Warhol already at that point. Through them, Paul Morrissey, the business manager of Andy Warhol, saw the Velvet Underground, and he knew that Warhol wanted to make money by sponsoring or managing a rock group. And then Warhol saw them. I think that although sometimes the impression is given, well, Andy Warhol just wanted a rock group to be part of this multimedia spectacle. It didn't matter so much what the rock group was. I think they were a really good fit, and I think Warhol realized that it wasn't just going to be a good rock group that was local, like the Rascals from Long Island, but one that was, like he was with his art and then through his underground films, exploring territory that had not been. They were doing that in rock music, and they were going into some subjects that his films did controversially, sexually and with drug use and with sort of outsider personalities. His contribution to the group, it's sort of mixed because he immediately got them more media attention than they could have possibly gotten with almost any other manager, because Warhol was already really famous as a pop artist and to some degree as a filmmaker. So when he, with the help of others, devised the multimedia show in which they played for like a year and a half, The Exploding Plastic Inevitable, they got way more media coverage than they would have gotten, especially as an unsigned band, through almost any other means. But being part of that EPI, as it's often abbreviated, it meant that the music was sort of overshadowed by the spectacle of the dancers and the films that were being projected and the flashing lights. If you read the media coverage of their first year and a half or so of concerts, they're almost mentioned incidentally as a sideshow, as part of this multimedia event. And also Nico, it was Warhol and Morrissey's idea to bring Nico into the group. She got way more media attention than the rest of the group combined, even though Lou Reed was writing and singing most of the songs and all of the others had very important artistic identities. But something very important Andy Warhol did, and the members were vocal about crediting him for this. He wasn't a producer of their first album in the sense of suggesting mic placement or ways to change how songs were, but he insisted you've got to keep the songs as they are, and especially use all of the dirty words in your songs. Don't self-censor anything. And he also gave Lou Reed a lot of encouragement as a songwriter. Reed said in a few interviews, Andy Warhol would often ask him, "What have you written lately?" or "What have you written today?" And Reed might have said, "Well, I wrote a couple new songs." And Warhol would say, "You've got to do more. You've always got to be working." And Warhol always was, although he had the image of letting other people do a lot of his work. And they took a lot of that inspiration from him, but by the middle of 1967, they, and especially Lou Reed, felt like they wanted to be known more for their music rather than as part of an Andy Warhol event.
Going back to Nico, one myth was that Nico was forced upon the band. How accurate is that characterization?
It was the idea of Paul Morrissey, who I interviewed him, really thinks of himself as the co-manager of the group with Andy Warhol and Andy Warhol, because especially Morrissey felt that the group needed more glamour, more visual appeal. And it wasn't their idea, but they were mollified when it was agreed that the billing could be the Velvet Underground and Nico, so it was kind of understood she was sort of separate and that she would only do a few songs, not the majority of them, or sing a few of the songs. Lou Reed would sing most of those. And I think they really benefited from her presence, even though she only sang lead on 3 Velvet Underground songs. They're all really good songs. They're all among their best songs, and they are enhanced by Nico's presence. All Tomorrow's Parties, Femme Fatale, I'll Be Your Mirror. She sings background on Sunday Morning, too. And I think at least with time, they realized, even when they were recording their first album, yes, this really helps the record, makes it more diverse, but her voice is a good fit, at least for these songs. It's not for I'm Waiting for the Man or something that's more propulsive rock. But with time going on, and I think there was some jealousy that she was getting so much media attention, they felt that there's not a whole lot we can fit her into, especially with the way our sound is changing in some regards to be more hard rock. But in retrospect, they all had comments that in some ways were positive. If they felt like she was forced upon them, I think they realized at the time, but certainly in retrospect, when she was with the group, she did add something to the group, but it couldn't last because it wasn't entirely compatible.
Richie Unterberger, the author of Do What You Fear Most, The History of the Velvet Underground. Talk a little bit more about the exploding plastic inevitable. It was unlike anything audiences had experienced before. For listeners who are unfamiliar with it, what exactly was it? How was that presented?
It's too bad that it's not preserved in great detail on film. There is a film, not by Warhol, by a guy named Ron Namath in Chicago, and it gives you some sense of what it was like, although Lou Reed was not with the group because he was in the hospital when that was being filmed. And Nico wasn't there either. But the idea was to have almost a sensory assault. Maybe that's not the best word, but an event that could be experienced from several different angles, not just watching and hearing somebody who's on stage. You could do that, but at the same time, there would be films, sometimes Warhol films, being projected on the group and in the background, sometimes with members of the group, the screen test that Warhol did, or sometimes not. These dancers that, if the Velvets didn't have much visual movement when they started, helped make that more exciting, kind of writhing to the music and enacting or acting out some of the songs like Venus and Furs. And also light show, which was a new innovation in rock music at that time. There were light shows elsewhere in San Francisco, New York, and some other cities. But Warhol himself would sometimes operate the lights or let people in the audience operate them to add a sense of unpredictability. And they were, at least by some of the audience, considered art events, not just musical events. And as I said, that's sort of a double-edged sword because maybe the qualities of the music weren't as apparent as they would have been in a more conventional concert setting. But it did draw a lot of people initially who might not have even gone to a rock concert or been considered above the usual age at that time for people going to rock shows, because it had Warhol's name sometimes in the advertising, but it was sort of considered performance art as well as a rock concert.
Was it in New York only?
No, it started in New York, And they, for about an entire month, were playing almost every night at a place in the village, the Dom. But then, over the course of 1966 and early 1967, the show went to California briefly, but also to Boston and Michigan and some other places, a couple gigs in Canada. What they should have done, and some members have said this in interviews, is take it to Europe, because in retrospect it was felt that they might have gotten a bigger audience if they had played in Europe, where they seem to have gained a lot of appreciation. Part of the reason it seems like they didn't go there, and there were discussions about bringing them to the United Kingdom and continental Europe, was that it was just so expensive to fly over like 20 people and support them and make them part of the show like they were in the United States.
Was it similar to, and I'm not sure what the timeline on this is, but was it similar to like Pink Floyd? Was it the UFO Club?
Yeah.
Kind of like that?
It seems like that was the case, but with Pink Floyd, it wasn't as elaborate, although it seemed pretty cool. There were light shows when Pink Floyd played in their very early years, say 1966 and early 1967. And those were some of the first light shows presented in Britain. They were concocted on, or at least partially inspired by, the reports they were reading in music papers of what was going on at San Francisco concerts. It didn't have the Pink Floyd shows at it's actually pronounced UFO Club, but understandably a lot of people think it's the UFO Club. It was a small place that concentrated on underground rock and the underground experience, but it didn't have those other dancers. It wouldn't have had the access to all of those underground films that Warhol made. So I don't know how to compare it too fairly, because there's not great film footage of either of those sort of events. And it would have been hard to capture on film at that point. But it seems simpler, maybe more basic with the Pink Floyd performances. But the people who were at the Pink Floyd performances really loved both the music and the light show aspect. And because there wasn't the Warhol name and the additional effects that the Exploding Plastic Inevitable had, maybe the audiences seeing early Pink Floyd concentrated more on the music, and they got more out of the music than they would have out of the Velvet Underground.
The Velvet Underground and Nico has gone from a commercial disappointment to one of the most influential albums ever made. Why did it fail to find an audience in 67? Was it too far ahead of its time?
I think it was too far ahead of its time, maybe better phrases, out of line with trends of the time. There was a business disappointment that had something to do with this, which I write about in the book. Shortly after the album came out, like just a couple of weeks afterward, somebody from the Exploding Plastic Inevitable, a dancer, Eric Emerson, he also acted in some Warhol films, his image was on the back of the record, not the front with the banana, but the back cover, and he sued to get the album pulled from distribution. The belief seems to be he wasn't intending to destroy the Velvet Underground or Warhol's career. He wanted some quick money. He wanted to get some money out of this. But what the effect was, and I, at the Andy Warhol archives, found correspondence about this, it went all the way up to the head of MGM Records, their record label, and he, or MGM Records, for all the albums that had been manufactured, they put stickers over them so that you couldn't see this guy, Eric Emerson. That delayed distribution of the album by quite a bit. And the album had just started to enter the top 200 in the low numbers, but then it disappeared for like a few months. And I do believe that had an effect. And then finally got back into distribution with that ugly sticker. But yet at the same time, they couldn't regain that momentum. Also, although FM radio, underground FM radio, was just starting, it would help people like Jimi Hendrix, who didn't have big hit singles, become big stars. It was just starting. Even a year or two later, there would be a lot more stations. They would have much more listeners that's where the record would be played. It wouldn't be played on AM radio with singles, although the Velvets did put out a couple singles. And the music was sometimes too underground for the underground, I think. It's unfair that songs like Heroin and a little later Sister Ray, they tab the Velvets as the image of being junkies who were advocating drugs. That's just a few of their songs, and they weren't really advocating drugs. They were more describing the hard drug experience. But that was considered too sort of devious for even a lot of underground rock listeners or programmers. The album did not do as bad as a lot of reports seem to have it, where it seems like, oh, it disappeared or it barely sold anything. According to a royalty statement from a couple years later, it sold 60,000 copies or so. And that's not a hit record, but it's not that bad. There were a lot of albums back then that sold a lot less. And over time, according to a lawyer who works with them, it has sold 3 million copies worldwide, but most of those were after Lou Reed left the group in 1970.
And then after the relatively melodic debut album, they took a dramatic left turn with White Light, White Heat. What inspired that shift? Were they deliberately trying to challenge listeners or even maybe alienate listeners, or what was the intent on that?
I don't think they ever wanted to alienate listeners, but they were determined to, if they decided on a certain direction, pursue that to the max, regardless of what commercial effect it might have. When you look at the playlist of the Velvet Underground that have survived from mid-66 to late 67, they could have done a much different record. It would have had to have been a double album where they could have had gentle songs like Stephanie Says, which didn't come out for a long time, or Here She Comes Now, which did make it on the record. They could have had a lot more songs like that. But I think they decided we only have space for one single disc. That's how it was with most groups. And we want to make a consistent sound, and we want to go all out. Except possibly for Here She Comes Now. All 6 of the songs are really loud and sometimes dissonant, or at the very least, kind of weird, like The Gift, which is a short story that's narrated by John Cale. And they recorded in a way that they didn't turn down their instruments, and the technology in late 1967 in the studio couldn't allow for the frequencies to be captured as they could have a few years later or certainly now. And the needles were going into the red, which causes distortion. And an engineer, it was probably Gary Kellgren, although they didn't really name him in interviews. Kellgren worked with Hendrix too, seemed to be really dismayed by their lack of caution and saying, we don't care if it goes into the red, we want to keep it that way. It was sort of that or nothing. They weren't going to turn down their instruments because they felt like it would sort of blunt the impact. It should not, however, have been a surprise that it didn't sell many copies. Not nearly as many even as the Banana album, because it was just so unrelenting. And just because of its length, Sister Ray, one of their better known songs, is 17 minutes. That wouldn't have been played on even FM radio very much. They were playing some really long songs like Inagata Davida, but not that one so much.
Well, there are only 6 tracks on there.
Yeah, that's
one of them 17 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, side 2, which is more than 20 minutes, is just 2 songs, and one of them 17 minutes.
John Cale's departure has been debated for decades. What ultimately led Lou Reed to decide it was time for a change?
That's still something of a mystery, because even though Reed and Cale and the rest of the Velvets, they did a lot of interviews, and no one has pinpointed, well, Lou Reed wanted to do these 2 songs and John Cale would absolutely not play on them. Something more concrete like that. Or Lou Reed was really angry at John Cale because he stole a girlfriend or something like that. Lou Reed never even speculated, well, it was a combination of blah, blah, blah. It was more like, that's really personal and I don't want to get into it. And John Cale, in some interviews, have said, I, to this day, don't really know. And Lou Reed, I think to his discredit, he did not fire John Cale personally. He had Sterling Morrison do it. I think that's pretty low. But here's my speculation, based on some of their comments, but also some comments of others. John Cale wanted to push the avant-garde aspect of the group. Lou Reed at this point, and you can hear it on the third album and some of the live stuff from 1969, he didn't want to become a normal group and sell out, but he wanted to do more straightforward songs. Songs which were more built around riffs, more danceable, or some ballads. I don't know if Cale has stayed in the group, if he could have stayed through, or the group could have endured through the third album, because I could see there might have been loggerheads, John Cale insisting, we've got to put these songs on, or we have to do the songs this way with a lot of electronics, screeching, some dissonance, and Lou Reed saying, no, these songs have to go on, it has to be this way. I wrote the songs, and maybe they would have broken up during the third album. It might not be a coincidence that Cale was fired only a month before the session started for the third album, and Doug Yule, who replaced John Cale, much more, quote, conventional rock musician, although a very good one, I think he could fit into the direction Lou Reed's songs were going better than Cale could have. And also, at least at the beginning, because he was younger than anyone else in the group, and he was a new guy, he was going to be somebody who wouldn't put up a fight if there were artistic disputes. That would change by 1970, but perhaps for the third album, that ensured that their record could go as certainly Lou Reed planned.
Yeah, that third album I want to ask you about. So that one is considered, it's often called Velvet Underground's most beautiful and emotionally intimate record. Some fans considered this Lou Reed songwriting masterpiece. Brian Eno called it his favorite Velvet Underground album. Why do you think so many musicians are especially drawn to it?
I think it's because of the strength of the songs, but also in a different way than White Light Heat. It's a statement that we're not going to, we meaning the Velvet Underground, do things people expect. And if we decide we want to explore a certain mood in depth, we're going to go all out. And as noisy as the second album was, make a record that's as quiet almost as it can possibly be. Just from my own experience, I didn't hear the Velvet Underground when they were active because I'm 64, but I didn't even hear them in depth until 1979 when I started college when I was 17. And I'd read about the third album in advance, so I wasn't totally shocked that it was much different from the second album and in fact from the Banana album and much quieter. But still, I found an import. It took some searching. It wasn't in print in the US. And I put on Candy Says, and I felt like they're trying, it's not only like they're trying to do something quiet, they're trying to be as quiet as possible, especially with that song, but also some others like Jesus and Pale Blue Eyes. And part of the reason musicians might be attracted to it is, A, it's sort of standard bearer of you can do stuff that people don't expect, that maybe people are going to resist to begin with, at least because you've established a certain image. But also the ambience of the record, I think that might be what attracts people like Brian Eno. It has a very ethereal sort of ambient quality, which adds to the mystery. It's almost like listening to it through a fog. And someone like Eno might be thinking, because he's, as you and probably most of your listeners know, he's produced and created a diverse range, extremely diverse range of sounds. He might be thinking, it's amazing that this sort of sound can be created that nobody else has, and it's not through technological wizardry or a lot of volume, it's through an unexpected combination of instruments. And it has that sound that is really hard for anybody to create, that could only be the Velvet Underground. I'm speculating. I don't know if that's exactly Eno's thoughts, but it might be the thoughts of people like Eno.
Right. Well, Lou Reed and Brian Eno, I think, were similar, taking sounds and creating something out of that. I know Lou Reed talked about that once. He's just fascinated with sounds and what you could do with them and put them together and create a piece of art.
Yeah, and he could do that with both hardcore experimental material, like he would on Metal Machine Music in his solo career, but even on something like I Heard Her Call My Name, he is almost using white noise with a song to create something that's in the middle territory between experimental music and rock music, or on their 69 live album, the live version of White Light, White Heat, which I think is a lot better than the studio version. The extended instrumental breaks, they are almost like a combination of white noise and really furious hard rock. That's sort of an underrated quality to Lou Reed, I think, certainly when he was with the Velvet Underground.
And then after that self-titled third album comes Loaded. Maybe that's the most popular because it's got Sweet Jane and Rock and Roll and Oh Sweet Nothing's on there. Those are classics. Looking back, do you think this represents Lou Reed at the peak of his songwriting powers?
I do think it represents him at the peak of his songwriting powers. I differ with some Velvet Underground fans in that I don't think it's always the best representation of the music of the Velvet Underground. Fortunately, there are live recordings of most of those songs. At the very least, although I prefer them in general, I think anybody would say they're very different. It's pretty different to experience Sweet Jane as sort of a slow, intense ballad instead of the anthemic, riff-driven rocker that it is on the Loaded record. New Age, I think, has better lyrics originally when it was performed live. Part of the issue with that is that when the record was being finalized, Lou Reed left the group. And there are still different accounts of how the mix was done. Lou Reed contended that some of the mix and the version of Sweet Jane, which is missing the bridge, was done without his approval. Doug Yule, in some interviews, has disputed that. But a couple of reasons why I might not elevate Loaded on the level of the other three albums. At that point, I do agree that Reed was at a songwriting peak, which really he had sustained since late 1965. The Velvets could have put out a very strong double album. There are a lot of songs that they were performing live that Reed put on his early solo albums, where at that point there were not Velvet Underground versions available. And some of them, like Satellite of Love, are really good. I think they deserve a place on a Velvet Underground album. And I don't necessarily think that the half of those songs that were selected were the best half, absolutely. But also, maybe because they had signed with a new record label, a very big one, Atlantic, they were thinking, we want to get more FM radio airplay. We want to be more popular. Nothing wrong with that. But the record is somewhat slicker and glossier than their previous three albums and certainly their live sound. I don't think that always served the material the best. But as I said, there are many listeners who love that record, and even if they're aware of all those alternate versions, that doesn't matter. They just love the record as it is.
Thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. Is Lou Reed responsible for that beautiful opening to Sweet Jane? Does he get credit for that?
I don't know if any single person is responsible.
It's such a beautiful sound. It's like you're walking into heaven.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's not related to the rest of the song melodically. And I did, and I was glad I was able to do so, talk to one of the co-producers of Loaded, Jeff Haslam. And he had barely been interviewed about the record. And when I did an interview with him about 3 years ago for the book, we talked for like between 1 and 2 hours. And he remembered at least helping to create that kind of cascade of notes. It's almost like a waterfall effect produced by guitars to make something arresting in the opening that was going to attract attention. It's almost separate from the rest of the song. But something interesting he did tell me is not so much related to this song specifically, but to the Loaded sessions. He felt that if Doug Yule hadn't been there, they could not have finished the record because Lou Reed was really up and down as far as the headspace necessary to focus on making the best record. And Doug Yule, who was, at least at that point, more level-headed, really helped pull it together as in several respects. As instrumentalist, he could play several instruments, although bass was the primary one with the Velvets, sometimes with his singing, but also his arranging skills. And I do think that Yule was a very underrated contributor to the Velvets the last 2 years that Reed was in the group.
Yeah, I want to ask a little bit more about him. Lou Reed, yeah, he was becoming increasingly unhappy during this period of when Loaded came out. He's quietly leaving the band at this point. Was there one defining event that pushed Lou to quit, or was it years of accumulated frustration for him?
I don't know so much years, but at the time, 1970, I think it was a few things that were contributing. One was that the record wasn't turning out exactly as he had hoped. I had an interesting comment from his first wife, who had just started a relationship with Reed around summer of 1970. And she said Lou would come back from the studio and say, "They're not listening to me. They're not listening to the way I want things done." It seems like in the past he had been able to get his own way most of the time, and maybe that was changing, in part because Maureen Tucker wasn't at the sessions. Doug Yule was being more assertive in his creative ideas. Sterling Morrison was sort of withdrawing from the sort of combative energy of the group, which led to some of their best ideas. But also I think it was dissatisfaction that Reed had with the manager who took over from Andy Warhol, Steve Sesnick. He felt like Sesnick was pushing him and the rock and the whole group to be more conventional rock stars and do the kinds of things that are necessary to sell records. And he also, I think, felt that this might have been more subconscious. He had been working really hard for 5 years, and although the Velvets had started the last couple of years to get really, really good reviews by the rock press, they were not selling a lot of records. He wasn't making significant money out of the group, and I think he was getting exhausted by the disparity between the quality of his work with the Velvets and the recognition and the financial rewards. His first wife did mention that to me as well. And all of that sort of and Doug Yule being harder to get along with now that Yule wanted a very strong voice in the way that the songs were done and the way that they were recorded. He got really frustrated, and instead of maybe, as he would have a year or two earlier, fighting to get his own way, just figuring, I want to walk away from this. I'm getting too burnt out by it.
He quietly left, as I mentioned. Did he have a meeting with the band and said, "I'm out"? Or was it just kind of like, we haven't heard from him in a while, we're just going to move on without him?
Doug Yule remembered that the Velvets for the whole summer, or 2 months in 1970, they played 5 nights a week at Max's Kansas City. And August 23rd was the end of one of those 5-night runs. And Doug Yule came to the next night where they were booked, expecting the whole band, including Reed, to be there. And their manager, Steve Sesnick, said, "Lou's not going to be here tonight." And Doug Yule said, at first I thought he meant, well, Lou's sick or something. He's not going to be here tonight. But then it was clarified, no, he's quit the group. That's how Doug Yule found out. And a guy that I interviewed, George Nardo, who was a friend of Doug Yule and Doug's younger brother, Billy, it was such a surprise that he was approached by Sesnick and said, "We know that you're a musician. Can you fill in for Lou Reed the next few nights?" On the spur of the moment. It wasn't like there was a meeting. Lou's left the group with the other guys who remain. Do you want to go on? Who do you want in the group? Can we get this guy in for just a few shows to finish our Max's residency? Another complication was Maureen Tucker did not play with them at Max's, although she went back into the group without Lou Reed. And maybe he was unhappy that the lineup, which had established a Velvet Underground sound, it was becoming more dissipated. Sterling Morrison not being as involved either, although he was still playing with them.
Was he
that frustration?
All of that. Was he non-confrontational, Lou Reed? Was he the type of guy that didn't confront people? And maybe that's why, because you mentioned him also with somebody who was fired and he had somebody else do it.
In those instances, it seems that way. In some other instances, it seems he was confrontational. He fired, according to what people have remembered, he fired Lou Reed in person, and Warhol wasn't happy about that. And there was, at least briefly, some genuine tension between them. But in those, I think with firing Cale, it was sort of like, it's not like arguing over how a song should go. He's going to be really angry, and he wanted to avoid that. But when he left the group, I think it was maybe, I really want to go off on my own and not do any music for a while, and I just want to disappear. I don't want to have arguments about it because all of these other arguments have worn me out. It wasn't the best way to do it. No, he should have talked to the other guys and even Maureen Tucker, if she wasn't performing with them, and said, this is why I want to leave. And it's interesting, Sterling Morrison, I obviously didn't interview him because he died in 95, but in a long interview he gave to a Spanish journalist, he said that Lou approached him shortly after he left the group and said, do you want to join me in a new group? And Morrison turned him down. And Morrison gave the reason, it's going to take us like 2 years to get back to where we were a couple weeks ago or a week ago when you left. He probably couldn't have used the Velvet Underground name because that was a point of dispute between the manager and Lou Reed. And something else about Loaded, I don't know if this figured into his thinking. One of the most interesting things I learned in writing the book, it's in some old obscure interviews, it's in more than one, is that Reed envisioned the first 3 Velvet Underground albums as installments in a novel, that each of them were different stories, and you could play them one after the other, and it would tell the story of a character's journey. It's not obvious, but when he explains it, you can kind of hear where he's coming from. In a letter that was recently discovered from September 1970, he clarified to somebody in Germany who was considering publishing a book of his lyrics, Loaded is not part of that sequence. It doesn't tell a story on its own, and it's not something that follows the other 3 albums. And maybe because that was something that was important to him, he felt like the way he constructed the albums was reaching the end of the road if he couldn't do that with the 4th album.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. So, Doug, I think you really answered this question already, but has history been a little too hard on him? Because he's often lived in John Cale's shadow.
I think definitely he might not be, I would say he isn't, a talent on the level of John Cale. That is not so important to me because the music that he did in the 2 years after joining the Velvets, when Lou was still in the group, I think is just as good as what they did with John Cale. It's different, but it's just as good. For some listeners who feel like the Velvets at their most out there, the most experimental, was by far the best thing that they did, they feel like the significant achievements that they had were only when John Cale was in the group. And I think that's totally wrong myself. They can also dismiss Doug Yule. He's just some guy that they got in who would listen to Lou Reed, and he would play these, quote, normal rock songs, although they weren't very normal when you compare them to other things going on. But he brought a lot to the group, not just because he could make that different sound really effective. He could play several different instruments. He was a good backup vocalist. Sometimes when he took over the lead vocal, like on Candy Says, it was really good contrast. And in a different way than Sterling Morrison and Maureen Tucker, for a while at least, he helped be part of the glue that kept this explosive combination of musical and emotional personalities together, because he was so competent, but at the same time creative, and was able to fit what the Velvets were doing into songs that were, as time proved, pretty accessible. And it's unfortunate that he's sometimes dismissed. For instance, although it doesn't seem to matter to him, when the Velvet Underground were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in the mid-90s, he was not included. Neither was Nico. And he actually plays on as many studio recordings of the Velvets as John Cale did. And there are other groups in the Hall of Fame, like Fleetwood Mac or Pink Floyd, where there are members who are only in the group for a fraction of their lifetime. That's just one instance. But the more important thing is I don't feel that he's recognized as a significant contributor to the Velvet sound. And it wasn't a mission of mine to correct that, but I wanted to make sure that what I wrote in this long book gave him full credit for what he achieved with the other members of the group.
For you personally, what would you say Velvet Underground would be at the peak of their powers? Which album?
This is maybe different from others that people would select. I think their best studio album is definitely the Banana album, their first album, which is their most popular record. But I think their absolute peak as a performing group is what was taped for the 1969 live double album. Most of that was taped in late 1969 in San Francisco. Some of it was taped in Texas, also in late 1969. And it's just a great record from beginning to end. A lot of their best songs, some songs which hadn't been released when they were together. But something else that's interesting is that, especially if you compare it to the many recordings of them as a live act that are in circulation, a lot of them haven't been released, and I discuss them in the book. There are few other groups from any point in rock history that would vary the songs they did from performance to performance. It wasn't like, these are the best 15 songs, let's do those 15 songs during this tour, which is the way that a lot of acts go about it, and let's do them in this sequence. But also, from performance to performance, they would make the songs themselves different. I'm Waiting for the Man in late 69. It's much different from the first album. It almost sounds like the slow train that builds momentum. Sweet Jane, as I mentioned, when it was first performed in 69, was a slow, more romantic ballad. I like the studio version, and I like the more standard rock versions too. But there was always a surprise, I think, when you saw the Velvets. I'm sorry I didn't get to see them at that point. I was 7 years old. But it must have been a really good experience.
Sure. So that live album that you're referring to, because they've had quite a few that have come out, for people to look for that one, was that, what year did that come out? There's one that came out in 93. Is that the one?
No, the double live album that's just called 1969 Velvet Underground Live.
I gotcha.
That
74.
came out, yeah, it was recorded in late 69, but it came out in 1974 when Lou Reed had become pretty popular as a solo act. And even though it was issued to exploit Reed's solo sort of stardom, and there was, even the billing has the Velvet Underground with Lou Reed, it was an entirely deserved release, whether the motives were, let's exploit Lou Reed while people are listening to some of his records. And it was a great deal. Double album, about 100 minutes of music, very well recorded for a live tape of that time, and showing the group at the peak of their instrumental and singing powers, I think.
Looking back at where Lou and John and Nico and the remaining members all found themselves after 1970, do you think Velvet Underground ended too soon, or did their short lifespan actually help cement their legendary status?
I don't think the short lifespan cemented it. Perhaps their relative obscurity did help, because when you discovered them, at least when I did, the late 70s, early 1980s, you couldn't hear their records on the radio, or very few of them, especially if you were listening to public radio. And it almost felt like this is a discovery. Not many other people I know about this, so this makes it even cooler. It's not like the Beatles are great, but everybody's discovered them, and it's not too hard to learn about their music, or the Rolling Stones, or the Beach Boys. But it's sort of almost a secret pleasure that eventually was shared by tens of millions of people, but that wasn't happening in the 70s and even into the early 1980s. But looking back, it's sort of like it is with many groups, including the Beatles. Although at the time, if I was a fan, I would have been really bummed out learning, oh, Lou Reed's left the group. I was really hoping that they would make a bunch more really good records. looking back, it would have been pretty hard to keep that combination of personalities together and working well. Same thing with the Beatles. They worked phenomenally well for 7 years, but there were too many interests pulling them apart. With the Velvets, I think it was especially the three most famous figureheads, certainly Reed and Cale, but Nico developed into a significant talent as a solo artist, and fortunately, John Cale was very involved in Nico's solo career, almost throughout her solo career. In the book, I just want to mention quickly, the focus is on the Velvet Underground as a group, but I also mention I discuss in detail the early Cale and Nico records because those were happening at the same time as the Velvets were still working with Lou Reed. And they're really good records, and they reflect some of what they had started to develop with the Velvet Underground.
The Booked on Rock podcast is part of the Boneless Podcasting Network. If you're a fan of classic rock and classic film like I am, go to boneless.lovable.app to find over 20 great shows there. That's boneless.lovable.app, or just go to bookedonrock.com, the Boneless Podcasting Network. It is what you want it to be. Listen with confidence. They never chased trends. They created their own path. Is that the band's greatest lesson for musicians today, for new musicians coming out today?
I think them creating their own path is a lesson, but I think it's also encouragement, although it's maybe not such consolation to groups that experience this. Sometimes, in my view, it takes a long time for really creative and individualistic music to find its full audience. You could say that of some other artists too, like Nick Drake, who only sold a few thousand records or so in his lifetime. He made 3 albums and then he died pretty young. But now there are several 100,000 minimum Nick Drake fans. With the Velvet Underground, their cult just built and built until it's not really a cult anymore. I mentioned 3 million copies have been sold of their first album, worldwide that is. But also, I think they have a multi-generational appeal that some of the big and even sometimes really good groups that were their peers did not. Creedence Clearwater Revival, they are a great group. They sold tons of records for like 2 or 3 years. But I don't think they have as avid a following among pretty young people as the Velvet Underground do. Because the Velvet Underground's way of expressing themselves and their message maybe resonates more durably and more eternally, I don't want to pick on Creedence, than some other groups that were very good and very popular who were peers of the Velvet Underground. It also gives people not just encouragement to follow their own path, but to experiment and also to figure that if you have some interesting ideas, you don't have to be the most technically proficient musicians, at least to begin with, to record and express them. It's the creativity and the content that matters more than whether you can play as well as somebody else.
Do What You Fear Most, the history of the Velvet Underground, out now. Find it wherever books are sold. Look for it at your nearest bookstore. If you want to find your nearest independent bookstore, go to bookedonrock.com. Richie, can people find you online?
Yes, my website is richieunterberger.com, my name with a .com at the end. And it's rather basic, but it has information about my books and some of the events that I do. I'm in the Bay Area in San Francisco, so not everybody, of course, can come to the live events, but some of them are on Zoom. Some of them are even free. So those events are listed there, and people can check them out if they want.
Well, thanks for coming back on. This is a fascinating conversation about an absolutely phenomenal band. So thank you. And the book is absolutely fascinating as well. So for those who are fans, it's a must read. Thank you, Richie.
Thanks for having me on, Eric.
That's it. It's in the books.